Inside the most inhumane prison in America. Some prisons are built to keep dangerous people away from society. Others are built to punish. But one American prison has earned a reputation so disturbing that former inmates, correctional officers, lawyers, psychologists, and human rights organizations have all described it using the same word: inhumane. Behind these walls, men can spend years without touching another human being. Some lose track of time. Some forget what another person's voice sounds like. Others begin talking to walls, hearing voices that are not there, or slowly losing the ability to function in the outside world. Yet supporters argue this prison houses America's most violent offenders, people considered too dangerous for any ordinary prison. So where's the line between necessary security and psychological torture? Because what happens behind these concrete walls may force you to rethink everything you thought you knew about justice. Before we go further, subscribe for more carefully researched documentaries exploring prisons, crime, and the justice system. And leave a comment sharing where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how many different countries follow these stories. Now, let's step inside one of America's most controversial prisons. The prison that became a symbol. When people debate America's most inhumane prison, one name appears again and again: Pelican Bay State Prison. Located in the remote forests of Northern California, hundreds of miles from major cities, Pelican Bay was designed differently from almost every prison that came before it. When it opened in 1989, California officials described it as the future of maximum security incarceration. It wasn't built around rehabilitation. It wasn't designed around education. It wasn't even designed around traditional imprisonment. It was designed around control. Specifically, absolute isolation. Its most infamous section became known simply as the Security Housing Unit, or SHU. Inside this building, prisoners identified as gang leaders, suspected gang associates, or individuals considered exceptionally dangerous could spend years confined almost entirely alone. For many, days blended into weeks. Weeks blended into years. Some remained there for more than a decade. Others stayed even longer. As you'll soon discover, leaving the SHU was often far more difficult than getting into it. Built for isolation. The average SHU cell measured roughly 8 by 10 feet. Imagine a small concrete box. No windows facing outside. No view of the sky. No grass. No trees. No horizon. Only gray walls. A steel door. And a narrow slot where food trays were passed. The fluorescent lights could remain on for long periods. Every sound echoed. Every movement became routine. For approximately 22.5 hours each day, many prisoners remained inside this single room. Meals arrived through the slot. Medical visits often happened while handcuffed. Conversations with staff were brief. Meaningful human interaction became rare. Supporters believed this environment prevented organized prison gangs from directing violence throughout California's correctional system. Critics argued something very different. They believed prolonged isolation itself became a form of punishment beyond the prison sentence. And scientific research would soon begin supporting some of those concerns. But before we examine the psychological effects, we first need to understand why so many people ended up there. Who was sent here? Most people imagine only serial killers or notorious murderers being placed inside the SHU. Reality was more complicated. Certainly, some prisoners committed extremely violent acts inside prison. Some assaulted officers. Others ordered attacks through prison gangs. Several had histories involving multiple homicides. But many others entered the SHU through a process known as gang validation. Correctional officials attempted to identify influential members of prison gangs such as the Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, and Nuestra Familia. Evidence could include confidential informants, tattoos, written materials, association with validated gang members, possession of coded messages, or other intelligence gathered by investigators. Officials argued these methods disrupted organized criminal networks operating behind bars. Civil rights attorneys questioned whether some prisoners were isolated based on evidence that would never meet criminal court standards. For years, that debate intensified. Because once someone entered the SHU, getting out became another battle entirely. A day that never changes. Morning arrived without sunlight. Only artificial lighting. Breakfast came through the slot. Minutes later, silence returned. Hours passed with almost nothing changing. Some inmates exercised alone by walking circles inside their cell. Others performed push-ups until exhaustion simply to make time move faster. Books became precious. Letters from family became lifelines. Many read the same novel repeatedly because there was little else available. If recreation was scheduled, prisoners were escorted individually while fully restrained. Their destination was often another concrete enclosure surrounded by towering walls and metal mesh overhead. Some prisoners called it a dog run. There was fresh air, but little else. No team sports. No conversation. No shared activity. Just another enclosed space. Then it was back inside. Again. Day after day. Month after month. Year after year. The routine rarely changed. But the human mind often did. And that's where the real controversy begins. What isolation does to the mind. Human beings evolved as social creatures. Our brains expect interaction. Conversation. Facial expressions. Movement. When those disappear for extended periods, unexpected changes can begin. Psychologists studying prolonged solitary confinement have documented symptoms including anxiety, depression, panic attacks, insomnia, difficulty concentrating, memory problems, hypersensitivity to sound, paranoia, hallucinations, and emotional instability. Not everyone experiences these effects equally. Some adapt better than others. But many experts warn that prolonged social isolation significantly increases psychological stress. Former inmates have described forgetting how to carry normal conversations. Some said they became frightened by ordinary human interaction after years alone. Others struggled simply making eye contact. Several lawsuits alleged California's prolonged isolation practices caused lasting psychological harm. State officials maintained that these housing decisions were necessary for institutional safety. The disagreement reached courtrooms. And eventually, the entire prison system would face enormous pressure to change. But before that happened, something extraordinary unfolded inside Pelican Bay. The hunger strike that shook California. In 2011, something almost unimaginable happened. Prisoners from rival gangs, groups responsible for decades of violence, found common ground. Thousands of inmates across California participated in coordinated hunger strikes protesting long-term solitary confinement and SHU conditions. Some refused meals for weeks. Their demands focused on reducing indefinite isolation, improving conditions, and changing gang validation policies. The protests attracted national attention. Human rights organizations joined the conversation. Medical professionals expressed concern. Lawmakers began asking difficult questions. The strikes expanded again in 2013. At one point, approximately 30,000 inmates across California reportedly participated to varying degrees. The protests became one of the largest prison hunger strikes in American history. Suddenly, the world was paying attention to a prison that many people had never heard of. But public attention alone wouldn't determine the future. The legal battle was only beginning. The lawsuit that changed everything. A landmark federal lawsuit challenged California's use of prolonged solitary confinement. Plaintiffs argued that keeping prisoners in extreme isolation for years, sometimes decades, violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Medical experts testified. Psychologists presented research. Former inmates described living in near-total isolation. California officials defended the system. They argued dangerous gang leaders required extraordinary security measures to protect staff and inmates across the state. Both sides agreed on one point. The prisoners involved posed significant management challenges. The disagreement centered on how those challenges should be handled. Eventually, California agreed to major reforms. Thousands of inmates became eligible for review. Many long-term SHU prisoners transferred into less restrictive housing. Gang validation policies changed substantially. Indefinite solitary confinement became far less common than before. But those reforms came only after decades of controversy. And they raised an uncomfortable question. If these conditions were eventually changed, what did that say about the years that came before? The officers inside. It's easy to view prisons through only one perspective. But correctional officers also worked inside these walls every day. Many entered dangerous environments knowing assaults could happen without warning. Some officers witnessed brutal attacks. Others responded to riots. Some lost colleagues. Many believed strict isolation prevented gang leaders from organizing violence that could spread throughout California's prison system. From their perspective, the SHU protected lives. Working there also carried psychological costs. Constant vigilance. Long hours. Stress. The knowledge that a routine escort could become violent within seconds. Some officers later spoke publicly about the emotional strain correctional work placed on them and their families. Understanding Pelican Bay means recognizing both realities. The suffering reported by prisoners. And the genuine security concerns faced by staff. Yet perhaps the biggest question remains unanswered. If isolation reduces violence inside prison, what happens when isolated prisoners eventually return to society? That answer may be even more unsettling. Leaving isolation? But can the mind leave too? Walking out of a SHU cell does not necessarily mean walking back into a normal life. For prisoners who spent 5, 10, 15, or even 20 years in near total isolation, freedom inside prison often became another challenge altogether. Something as ordinary as hearing dozens of people talking at once could feel overwhelming. The sound of metal doors slamming, the noise of a crowded dining hall, the movement of hundreds of inmates. For someone whose world had been reduced to concrete walls and silence, these everyday experiences could trigger anxiety or panic. Psychologists have long warned that prolonged isolation can make social reintegration extremely difficult. Some former prisoners described feeling safer inside a small cell than among other people. Others struggled to make simple decisions after years of having every minute controlled. One inmate explained during court testimony that he no longer knew how to trust anyone. Another said eye contact had become uncomfortable because he had gone years without meaningful conversations. These accounts varied from person to person. Not everyone experienced the same effects. But together they painted a troubling picture. If rehabilitation is one goal of imprisonment, what happens when years of isolation make normal human interaction itself feel unfamiliar? That question continues to influence correctional policy across America. And it leads directly to another disturbing reality. Because isolation was only one part of life inside Pelican Bay, violence still found its way inside. Violence beyond the cell door. Many people assume solitary confinement means complete safety. The reality is more complicated. Whenever inmates left their cells, for medical appointments, legal visits, showers, or recreation, there remained opportunities for violence. Correctional officers had to plan every movement carefully. Housing assignments, escort routes, exercise schedules, even the timing of showers. Mistakes could have deadly consequences. California's prison system has long struggled with organized prison gangs whose influence extended beyond individual institutions. Investigators alleged that gang leaders sometimes communicated through coded letters, intermediaries, or hidden messages despite strict security measures. Officials argued these ongoing threats justified extraordinary restrictions. Critics responded that extreme isolation addressed symptoms rather than underlying problems. The debate continues today. Because prison gangs did not disappear, they adapted. And understanding them helps explain why Pelican Bay became so controversial. But before we examine those organizations, there's another rule inside prison that outsiders rarely appreciate. Sometimes survival depends less on strength and more on silence. The silent rules of survival. Every prison develops its own unofficial code. Pelican Bay was no different. Whether housed in general population or maximum security, prisoners quickly learned that words carried consequences. Talking too much, asking the wrong questions, showing fear, appearing disrespectful, violating racial or gang expectations. Any of these could place someone in danger. Former inmates have described prison as a place where every action is observed. Who you speak to, where you stand, how long you look at another inmate. Even something as simple as accepting food from the wrong person could create obligations or conflicts. Correctional officers maintain their own rules as well. Compliance during searches, following escort procedures, responding immediately to orders. Failure could result in disciplinary action. For inmates trying simply to survive their sentence, navigating these formal and informal systems became a daily challenge. Many learned quickly, others never did. And when rules were broken, punishment could arrive suddenly. Sometimes officially, sometimes unofficially. Discipline inside America's toughest housing unit. Discipline inside Pelican Bay extended far beyond criminal prosecution. Infractions inside prison carried their own consequences. Depending on the violation, inmates could lose privileges, receive disciplinary reports, or face additional restrictions. Cells could be searched without warning. Property inspected. Letters reviewed under institutional regulations. Visits suspended. Telephone access limited. Every prison in America relies on discipline to maintain order. But inside one of the nation's most restrictive facilities, even relatively minor violations could feel especially severe because so few privileges existed to begin with. For inmates already spending nearly every hour alone, losing access to books, recreation time, or family visits carried enormous emotional weight. Supporters believed strict discipline prevented violence. Critics argued excessive restrictions increased hopelessness. And hopelessness can become dangerous in its own way. Because one of the greatest challenges facing correctional systems is not violence between inmates. It's the quiet crisis happening behind closed doors. The mental health crisis. Mental illness has become one of the most significant issues throughout American corrections. Pelican Bay was no exception. Over the years, numerous mental health professionals questioned whether prolonged solitary confinement should be used for inmates already suffering psychological disorders. Research increasingly suggested that isolation could worsen existing mental illnesses. Anxiety, depression, psychosis, post-traumatic stress. Some inmates required psychiatric treatment while housed in restrictive units. Others entered prison without diagnosed mental illness but later developed symptoms after years of isolation. Correctional systems across America have gradually expanded mental health services, though critics argue resources remain insufficient. The challenge is complex. Many prisoners have extensive histories of trauma long before incarceration. Violence, substance abuse, childhood neglect. Mental illness often intersects with criminal behavior in ways that are difficult to separate. Pelican Bay became one of the central examples in this national conversation. Not because every inmate experienced psychological deterioration, but because enough documented cases raised profound questions. Could any human being remain psychologically healthy after years without normal social contact? Even today, experts continue debating the answer. Families on the outside. For many families, Pelican Bay's location created another hardship. The prison sits near Crescent City, California, more than 700 miles from Los Angeles. For relatives living in Southern California, a single visit often required long drives, hotel stays, lost wages, and significant expense. Some families simply could not afford the journey. Months passed, then years, without face-to-face contact. Children grew up with fathers they barely remembered. Parents aged without seeing their sons. Spouses tried to preserve relationships through letters and occasional phone calls. Former family members have spoken publicly about the emotional toll of maintaining connections across such distance. Isolation affected more than prisoners. It affected everyone waiting outside. And for some inmates, those outside connections became the only reminder that another life still existed beyond concrete walls. Without them, hope became increasingly difficult to hold on to. The world's attention turns toward Pelican Bay. As lawsuits expanded and hunger strikes gained attention, Pelican Bay became an international symbol. Organizations including legal advocacy groups, medical experts, and human rights observers criticized prolonged solitary confinement. Some compared extended isolation to psychological torture. California officials strongly rejected that characterization. They maintained that difficult security challenges required exceptional measures. Other countries watched closely. Some nations began reconsidering their own use of long-term isolation. International standards, including the United Nations Mandela Rules, increasingly emphasized limiting prolonged solitary confinement because of potential psychological harm. Although those standards are not automatically binding on U.S. prisons, they influenced public discussion. Pelican Bay had become larger than one prison. It represented a broader debate. How should modern societies punish their most dangerous offenders? Where should security end and humanity begin? The answer remains deeply contested. But another prison would soon emerge, raising many of the same questions. And some experts believe its conditions may be even more restrictive. Is Pelican Bay still the same prison today? The Pelican Bay of today is not identical to the Pelican Bay of the 1990s or early 2000s. Following legal settlements and policy reforms, California significantly reduced the use of indefinite SHU confinement based solely on gang validation. Many inmates transferred into different housing units. Review processes changed. Programming opportunities expanded for some prisoners. The prison remains one of California's highest security institutions. Violence has not disappeared. Dangerous offenders are still housed there. Strict security remains essential. But the system operating today reflects years of legal challenges, political debate, and public scrutiny. Whether those reforms went far enough remains a matter of continuing discussion. Some believe they represent meaningful progress. Others argue more changes are still needed. Yet regardless of where someone stands, Pelican Bay permanently changed the national conversation about solitary confinement. And perhaps that is its greatest legacy. Because once the public looked behind these walls, it became impossible to ignore the questions waiting inside. A prison that forced America to ask difficult questions. Prisons exist to protect society. Few people dispute that. The men housed inside Pelican Bay included murderers, gang leaders, violent offenders, and individuals responsible for terrible crimes. Correctional officers deserve protection. Other inmates deserve protection. Communities deserve protection. Those realities cannot be ignored. But another reality also emerged. Human beings, even those convicted of serious crimes, remain human beings. If punishment destroys the mind rather than simply restricting freedom, has justice crossed a line? Or is such suffering unavoidable when managing the most dangerous offenders in the country? There are no simple answers. Only difficult choices. Choices made by lawmakers, correctional administrators, judges, and ultimately, society itself. Because every prison reflects the values of the nation that built it. And every generation must decide what justice should look like behind closed doors. The men who lived inside. Statistics explain how a prison operates. People explain what it feels like. Over the years, former Pelican Bay inmates have described an experience that few people outside those walls can truly imagine. Many said the hardest part was not the concrete cell. It was the silence. Days could pass without a meaningful conversation. Weeks blurred together. Some prisoners counted cracks in the wall. Others memorized every sound in the hallway, eventually learning which officer was approaching simply by recognizing the rhythm of footsteps. Time itself became difficult to measure. One former prisoner recalled celebrating birthdays only because family members mentioned the date in letters. Another said he stopped thinking in weeks or months and instead measured life by meal trays. Several prisoners spoke about creating routines simply to stay mentally active. Reading every book available. Writing letters that sometimes took weeks to receive a response. Exercising until exhaustion. Reciting memories from childhood over and over to avoid forgetting them. Not every inmate reacted the same way. Some appeared remarkably resilient. Others struggled profoundly. But nearly all agreed on one point. Isolation changes people. Sometimes in ways that are difficult to reverse. The officers behind the uniform. It would be incomplete to tell this story without acknowledging another group that lived behind these walls every day. The correctional officers. Working at Pelican Bay demanded constant awareness. Many inmates housed there had histories of extreme violence. Some had assaulted staff at previous institutions. Others had been involved in organized prison gang activity spanning multiple prisons. Routine procedures existed for a reason. Every escort, every cell search, every meal, every movement required planning. A single mistake could place officers or inmates in danger. Former staff members have described the emotional burden of never fully relaxing during a shift. Even after returning home, many found it difficult to leave the prison mentally behind. Some struggled with stress. Others experienced burnout after years working inside one of America's toughest correctional environments. While public attention often focused on prisoners, correctional staff also carried invisible psychological burdens. For many officers, maintaining order wasn't simply policy. They believed it was what prevented deadly violence. Their perspective became an important part of the national debate surrounding Pelican Bay. The court of public opinion, long before reforms reached the prison, the debate had already spread far beyond its walls. Law professors questioned whether decades of isolation violated constitutional protections. Psychologists warned about long-term mental health consequences. Former correctional officials defended the necessity of restrictive housing for certain inmates. Victims' advocates reminded the public that many prisoners housed at Pelican Bay had committed devastating crimes. Families of correctional officers emphasized the dangers staff faced every day. There was no single narrative. Only competing realities. One side argued that extraordinary criminals required extraordinary security. The other argued that no prison should inflict conditions that permanently damage the human mind. For years, Americans wrestled with those competing truths. The discussion continues today. Not only in California, but throughout the United States. The legacy that changed American corrections, Pelican Bay's influence reaches far beyond Northern California. Its history helped reshape conversations about solitary confinement across the country. Several states reviewed their own restrictive housing policies. Correctional departments introduced new mental health screening procedures. Some reduced the length of solitary confinement. Others expanded educational or therapeutic programs for inmates leaving isolation. Research into the psychological effects of long-term segregation accelerated. Lawmakers began asking questions that had rarely been discussed decades earlier. How long is too long? Should mentally ill prisoners be housed in isolation? Can maximum security coexist with rehabilitation? These questions remain unresolved. But because of Pelican Bay, they can no longer be ignored. Its legacy is not only the prison itself. It is the conversation it forced America to have. What justice really means. Pelican Bay was built to contain the people considered the most dangerous in California's prison system. It succeeded in becoming one of the most secure prisons ever constructed. But security came with consequences that continue to divide experts, lawmakers, correctional officers, and the public. Some believe its strictest policies prevented countless acts of violence. Others believe those same policies crossed a moral line. History rarely offers simple answers. Instead, it leaves difficult questions for future generations. How should society punish its most violent offenders? Can justice remain humane without becoming weak? Can security exist without sacrificing dignity? And perhaps the most difficult question of all: when the prison sentence ends, what kind of person has years of extreme isolation created? The answers affect far more than the people behind bars. They shape the future of criminal justice itself. Pelican Bay remains one of the clearest reminders that every prison is more than concrete walls and steel doors. It is a reflection of what society believes punishment should be. And that debate is far from over. Pelican Bay State Prison remains one of the most controversial correctional facilities in American history. While many of its most criticized practices have been reformed, its legacy continues to influence prison policy, legal decisions, and debates about human rights throughout the United States. Whether viewed as a necessary response to extreme violence or as a cautionary example of the psychological cost of prolonged isolation, one thing is certain. The story of Pelican Bay is not just about one prison. It is about how a society chooses to balance justice, security, and humanity. Only history will decide whether that balance was ever truly achieved. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more in-depth documentaries on prisons, crime, and the justice system, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know which prison or criminal case you'd like to see explored next. Until next time, thank you for watching.